You did not arrive here by accident. Something in you knew to stop here, even if your mind would prefer to call it curiosity, timing, or another passing click. It was not that simple. People cross thousands of messages every day and feel nothing. They scroll past words, faces, promises, warnings. Nothing reaches them because nothing is meant to. But every so often, a message appears at the exact moment a person can no longer remain who they have been. That is the moment that matters. That is the moment you are in now. If this message found you at the exact moment you needed it, like this video and comment one word, remember, to anchor the truth you already felt. This is not about luck. It is not just algorithm. It is not random exposure. The surface of life always gives you a convenient explanation. It tells you this appeared because of patterns, data, habits, digital behavior that may explain the mechanics. It does not explain the timing. It does not explain why this found you now and not a month earlier when you would have ignored it, or a week later when the opening inside you would already begin to close. There are moments when your life looks normal from the outside, but inside a threshold has already been crossed. You may still be answering messages, showing up to routines, speaking the same way, wearing the same face, but something in your inner structure has started to break with the old arrangement. The role that used to fit no longer fits. The explanations that used to calm you no longer calm you. The distractions that used to keep you occupied are losing their power. That is not instability. That is not weakness. That is the first sign that your system can no longer be held together by what once kept it asleep. You are here because one part of you has reached the point where it cannot continue living on borrowed meaning. That is why this moment feels sharper than it should. That is why it carries more weight than ordinary content. A person who is still fully identified with the old rhythm does not recognize this kind of opening. They hear words and move on. They do not feel the pressure behind them. They do not sense the precision of the encounter. But when something real is shifting inside you, recognition becomes immediate, not dramatic, not theatrical, just unmistakable. You may have felt it before you understood it. A pause that lasted a second too long. A quiet tightening in the chest, a subtle sense that you were supposed to hear this. Not because you are special in the childish sense, not because the universe is flattering your ego, because readiness has consequences. Once a certain level of tension builds between who you are and who you keep pretending to be, life starts arranging more direct confrontations, not to punish you, to stop the delay. That is what most people miss. They think important moments announce themselves with noise. They expect clarity to arrive as a grand event. It rarely does. More often it arrives like this. Precise, quiet, irreversible. A sentence appears. A message lands. Something in you stops arguing for one honest second. And in that second, this is not just another piece of information. Something in you has been approaching this point for a while. The old explanations are no longer enough. And, whether you admit it yet or not, that if you turn away from this kind of moment too many times, you do not stay unchanged. You become harder, duller, more divided from yourself. That is the real cost of ignoring what reaches you at the right time. Not punishment, fragmentation. There is a reason this feels rare. It is rare. Not because truth is scarce, but because receptivity is. Most people are not unavailable because truth is hidden from them. They are unavailable because noise still has more authority than honesty. Their habits are louder than their knowing. Their fear is more trusted than their perception. So life keeps moving around them, and they call it fate, bad timing, confusion, or burnout. But there comes a point when the old noise starts failing. That point is not comfortable. It can look like restlessness, disappointment, detachment, fatigue, or even numbness. Yet beneath all of it is one simple fact. The old version of you is losing the ability to lead. That is why this is not casual. That is why this is not just something you happen to hear. And that is why this moment cannot be treated the same way you treat ordinary content. You are not here because you wanted more stimulation. You are here because some deeper layer in you has become unwilling to keep negotiating with what it already knows is over. Even if you cannot name it yet, you have felt the friction. The distance between your outer life and your inner truth has grown too large to ignore. When that happens, the right message does not feel entertaining. It feels exposing. It names what your mind has been trying to soften. It puts pressure on what you have been delaying. It removes the comfort of pretending you still have unlimited time to remain undecided. That is why the timing matters. Not every opening stays open. There are windows in human awareness that appear with precision and close the same way. A person can be near the truth for years and still miss it because they wanted one more excuse, one more sign, one more round of avoidance. Then the moment passes, and they call the silence that follows confusion. It is not confusion, it is contraction. It is what happens when a real opening is not entered. So understand this clearly. You are not here because your attention wandered in the right direction. You are here because something in you is done, waiting for your surface mind to catch up. That is the real event. Not the message itself, not the screen, not the words. The event is that a deeper intelligence in you has become strong enough to interrupt the pattern. And once that starts happening, your life does not continue under the old terms for very long. That is why you are here now. Not for novelty, not for comfort, not for decoration. You are here because a part of you has already crossed the line, and the rest of you is about to find out. You have probably noticed that something has been changing, even if you have not had the language for it. Not all change announces itself as a clear event. Sometimes it begins as a quiet mismatch. You wake up and the life around you still looks familiar, but it does not sit in you the same way. Places feel flatter. Conversations feel thinner. Reactions that once felt normal now feel borrowed. You try to return to the version of yourself that used to move through all of this without friction, and something in you refuses. That refusal matters, because what is happening is not simple confusion. It is not a passing mood. It is not just fatigue. It is the growing recognition that your inner state and your old frequency are no longer in agreement. This often starts in the most private place first. Inside, you may have felt a strange emptiness, but not the emptiness of having nothing. More like the emptiness that appears when what used to define you begins to lose its authority. You may have become less certain about what excites you, less willing to perform certainty, less interested in keeping up the emotional habits that once made you legible to other people. There may be moments when you feel quiet in a way that is unfamiliar, almost as if your system is withholding energy from a life it no longer wants to maintain in the same form. That can be unsettling if you interpret it through the old lens. You might call it disconnection. You might wonder if something is wrong because you do not feel the same urgency, the same appetite, the same attachment to what used to pull you forward. But a deeper reading is often more accurate. It is not that you have lost yourself. It is that the self you built around old conditions is no longer fully compatible with what is opening now. That is why some people feel both empty and more awake at the same time. Part of you feels stripped. Another part feels alert. Part of you cannot find the old center. Another part knows the old center was never meant to hold forever. That inner contradiction is one of the clearest signs that a separation is underway, not separation from truth, separation from the frequency that kept you identified with a smaller version of yourself. And while this has been happening inside, life around you may have started changing its rhythm in ways that feel too specific to dismiss. Relationships may have shifted without a clean explanation. People you expected to remain have become distant, harder to reach, or suddenly irrelevant. Conversations that once felt natural now feel strained. You may notice yourself withdrawing from dynamics you used to tolerate with ease. Not because you became cold, but because your system stopped wanting to pay the price of false alignment. The same thing can happen in work. Tasks that once made sense can start to feel dead in your hands. Environments that used to feel manageable begin to feel loud, heavy, or strangely misaligned. You may find yourself staring at routines that once organized your life, realizing that they no longer produce conviction, only repetition. This does not always mean you know exactly what to do next. Often you do not, but with increasing certainty, what no longer fits. That matters more than most people realize, because the first honest movement in real change is rarely clear direction. It is clear incompatibility. You stop being able to digest what once sustained you. You stop being able to fake enthusiasm for paths that no longer carry your signal. You stop being able to call survival by the name of purpose. This is why life can feel unstable during periods like this. The old structure begins loosening before the new one has fully formed. Timing changes, energy changes, people enter and exit. Delays appear where you expected momentum. Openings appear where you expected walls. From the outside, it may look like disruption. From the deeper level, it is often reorganization. And then there is the third layer, the one many people notice but hesitate to trust. The signs, not vague imagination, not a desperate need to make everything meaningful, actual repetition, certain numbers appearing too often to ignore, the same themes arriving from different directions, thoughts answered by events, questions met by language, symbols, or encounters that land with unusual precision. You think of someone and they appear. You wrestle with a decision and the world begins reflecting it back in strange, specific ways. On their own, each event can be explained away. That is not the point. The point is the pattern. When patterns intensify, they do not always come to entertain you. Sometimes they come because your conscious mind is no longer the only part of you trying to steer. A deeper intelligence begins pressing through the cracks, using repetition to bypass your resistance. It speaks in recurrence because recurrence is harder to ignore. It places emphasis where you have become numb. It creates a trail where logic alone would keep you circling. At the same time, your intuition may have become sharper, but less comfortable. You sense things before they happen. You feel people more quickly. You walk into places and know almost immediately whether your system expands or contracts. You cannot always explain what you know, and that may frustrate the part of you that still wants evidence before honesty. But the knowing is there, clearer than before, faster than before, less willing to be argued with. And underneath all of it, there is often one persistent feeling. Something is coming. Not in the dramatic sense that people use to romanticize change, more in the quiet, undeniable sense that your life is no longer staying where it was. You may not know the form yet, you may not know the timeline, but you can feel the approach. A pressure, a readiness, a gathering, as if reality itself has been rearranging pieces around a moment that has not fully shown its face yet. This is where many people become frightened and call themselves lost. But lost is not the right word. Lost means there is no pattern. Lost means there is no intelligence in the disruption. Lost means nothing is responding. That is not what this is. If you are seeing repeated signs, if your inner world no longer fits the person you have been, if your outer life is shifting in ways that expose what no longer belongs, and if a deeper knowing has started moving ahead of your explanations, then you are not lost. You are being separated from the old frequency. That separation can feel lonely at first because the old frequency was not just your environment, it was your orientation. It shaped your habits, your relationships, your expectations, your language for what a normal life should feel like. When that starts falling away, the mind often interprets the space as emptiness. But emptiness is not always absence. Sometimes it is clearance. Sometimes life has to quiet what no longer matches you before it can reveal what does. That is why the discomfort has a pattern. That is why the signs keep repeating. That is why your system no longer lets you fully return to the surface. You are not becoming unstable. You are becoming unavailable for what used to keep you asleep. And once that process begins, the old world does not feel wrong because it changed. It feels wrong because you did. What you call the breaking point may have been preparation all along. That is the part most people resist, because it asks them to look back at pain without using the old language. The old language says, you were rejected, delayed, punished, abandoned, thrown off course. It says the losses were proof that life was against you. It says the confusion meant failure. It says the isolation meant something was wrong with you. That reading is common, but it is often shallow. It describes the wound. It does not explain the intelligence inside the wound, because not everything that falls apart is destruction. Some things fall apart because they should not have been carrying you any further. Some things leave because they were only built to survive a previous version of you. Some structures collapse because life has stopped agreeing to support what no longer matches who you are becoming. that changes the meaning of the past completely. The difficult season was not necessarily punishment. It may have been pressure. Not pressure to break you, but pressure to expose what could not remain hidden if you were going to move honestly. When life begins preparing a person for a different level of self-contact, it does not always begin by adding clarity. It often begins by removing what kept them numb. That is why pain can feel so disruptive. It interrupts the arrangement. It takes away the smooth lie. It reveals how much of your identity was built around adaptation, approval, survival, and repetition. It brings you face to face with what you called normal and asks whether normal was ever truly alive. Pain did not always come to destroy you. Sometimes it came to strip the version of you that could no longer carry the truth. There were losses that seemed unfair at the time. Relationships ended, plans failed, doors closed after you invested trust in them. You may have tried to read those moments as evidence that you were not chosen, not supported, not aligned. But another reading is often more precise. Those losses were not always removing something valuable from your path. In many cases, they were removing your dependence on what could never take you where you were being pushed to go. Loss builds capacity in ways comfort never can. It builds the ability to stand in uncertainty without collapsing. It builds discernment, because once something has broken your illusions, you become less willing to decorate what is empty. It builds inner honesty, because after real loss, performance starts to feel exhausting. It builds a quieter kind of strength, the kind that does not need applause because it was forged in private. This is why some of the hardest seasons of your life did more than hurt you. They trained you, they widened you, they created room in you for a different order of perception, not by giving you answers, but by taking away what made shallow answers feel sufficient. The same is true of isolation. You may have thought you were being abandoned when certain people stopped understanding you, when familiar circles started feeling distant, when conversations that once gave you a sense of place began to feel thin. But isolation is not always rejection. Sometimes it is signal protection. When a deeper layer of your awareness starts coming online, noise becomes more expensive. The mind may still crave company, approval, or familiarity, but your system becomes less willing to pay for them with self-betrayal. So life begins reducing interference. Not always gently, not always on a schedule you would have chosen, but with precision, people fall away. Places lose their charge. Roles that once gave you identity start feeling strangely unreal. The loneliness of that period can be intense if you interpret it only as loss. But often what is actually happening is a clearing. The static is being lowered. The crowd inside you is thinning. The borrowed voices are losing volume. You are being removed from frequencies that kept you externally connected and internally divided. That is not abandonment. That is preparation for a cleaner signal. There were also moments that felt like the opposite of loss. Moments when things worked with unusual precision. The right person appeared at the right time. An opportunity opened faster than expected. A needed answer arrived from an unlikely place. You may have dismissed those moments as luck because they were easier to accept that way, but taken together, they formed a pattern of response. Reality was not only testing your endurance, it was showing you that it could answer. That matters. Because breakthrough is not just relief, it is evidence. It is evidence that conditions can rearrange faster than your old logic allows. It is evidence that not every door is forced open by effort. It is evidence that your inner state and outer movement are more connected than you were taught to believe. Those moments were not random rewards dropped into a hard life. They were demonstrations. They were proof that the field around your life responds when the deeper alignment is real. Not always instantly, and not always in the form the ego requested, but with unmistakable intelligence. You needed both sides. You needed the losses that dismantled false dependence, and you needed the breakthroughs that showed you life was still listening. Without the losses, you would have remained attached to structures that no longer fit. Without the breakthroughs, you would have mistaken your dismantling for abandonment. Together, they created a more accurate education. Then there is the strange sense of speed that often appears in these seasons, periods when too much changes at once, emotional shifts, relational shifts, practical shifts, inner shifts, months that contain the weight of years, decisions that seem to arrive before the mind has fully caught up, events clustering so tightly that ordinary language cannot explain the pace. Many people interpret that acceleration as chaos. But acceleration is not always chaos. Sometimes it is compression. Life is not always moving faster because it is out of control. Sometimes it is moving faster because what needs to leave, and what needs to surface, can no longer be delayed. What feels like too much can in fact be concentration, a longer process being pulled into a narrower window, a lesson that once might have taken years arriving in one season because your system is no longer available for the slower version. That is why you may have felt as though your life was being rearranged all at once. Not because you were being singled out for suffering, but because the old timeline had become inefficient. What once could have unfolded gradually now had to move with force. There was no more use in preserving identities, attachments, or environments that were already losing coherence. This is where the meaning changes. The pain did not prove you were off path. It often proved the path had become too honest to let you remain divided. The isolation did not mean you were forgotten. It often meant your signal was being protected from distortion. The collapse did not mean life was against you. It often meant life was no longer willing to finance the version of you that had expired. The breakthroughs were not random gifts. They were evidence that reality responds when something true is finally chosen. And the acceleration was not always punishment. It was often compression, the shortening of distance between who you had been and what you were being forced to recognize. This is why the past cannot be read through the same lens anymore. If you keep calling every rupture a failure, you will miss the architecture inside it. If you keep calling every ending bad luck, you will overlook what the ending prevented. If you keep calling every quiet season emptiness, you will never hear what could only arrive when the noise stopped. A more accurate sentence would be this: what you called crisis may have been life withdrawing support from the identity that could not go with you. Sit with that carefully, because if that is true, then your history has not been a record of random damage. It has been a sequence of precise removals, necessary pressures, and strategic openings. Not clean, not easy, not sentimental, but intelligent. And once you see that, the past stops looking like evidence that you were broken. It starts looking like evidence that something in you is being prepared to survive the loss of everything false. What is happening right now is not limited to information. If it were only information, you would be processing it the way you process everything else. You would compare it to what you already believe. You would sort it, judge it, accept parts, reject parts, and move on. That is how the surface mind handles content. It classifies, measures, and protects continuity. It makes sure nothing enters too deeply unless it can be reduced to something already familiar. But that is not fully what is happening here. Something else has already begun, and you may have noticed it before you had language for it. A shift in attention, a narrowing of noise, a sense that these words are not simply being heard, but are landing in a part of you that has been waiting without knowing what it was waiting for. That difference matters. Because the moment a message stops feeling merely descriptive and starts feeling strangely exact, the exchange changes. It stops behaving like content and starts behaving like recognition. That is why this moment feels different from ordinary listening. You are not just collecting ideas, you are noticing what happens in you as certain layers are named. That response is not accidental, it is not decorative, it is not there to make the experience more emotional. It is data. Pay attention to the body for a second. Not dramatically, not with effort, just honestly, there may be pressure in the chest that does not feel exactly like anxiety. There may be a slight stillness in the head that does not feel exactly like fatigue. There may be tingling in the arms, a subtle pull in the stomach, a quiet vibration in the spine, a heat rising in the face, or the strange feeling that time has slowed down by a fraction. None of this needs to be exaggerated. None of it needs to be performed. The point is simpler than that. Your system may be responding because something in it recognizes the signal before the mind has finished translating it. That is an important distinction. Most people have been trained to trust meaning only afterthought explains it, But your deeper system does not always wait for explanation. It often registers truth through tension, release, contraction, stillness, heat, or sudden clarity long before the mind builds a sentence around it. The body is often the first place the old order loses control. So if your chest feels heavier than usual, do not rush to call it stress. If your thoughts seem quieter than normal, do not rush to call it exhaustion. If your attention feels unusually fixed, do not rush to call it coincidence. Sometimes the pressure in the chest is not distress. It is resistance being touched. Sometimes the stillness in the mind is not depletion. It is interference dropping. Sometimes the sensation of being pulled inward is not confusion. It is the old pattern losing authority over your perception. This matters because the mind prefers familiar diagnoses. Familiar diagnoses preserve the familiar self. If everything can be reduced to stress, tiredness, overthinking, or mood, then nothing truly has to change. But there are moments when those explanations become too small for what is taking place. There are moments when your responses stop looking like symptoms and start looking like signals. That is the more accurate reading here. You are not simply reacting to words, you are decoding them. And decoding is not the same as agreement. It does not require blind belief. It does not require performance. It means that a deeper layer in you is recognizing structure, resonance, and pattern inside what is being said. It means something in you is not waiting for external permission to know. That is why language matters here, but only to a point. Words are useful. They give shape. They create entry. They focus attention. But words are not the deepest layer of what reaches a person in a moment like this. They are the visible layer. They are the carrier. They allow something less verbal to pass through in an organized way. That is why two people can hear the same sentence and have completely different experiences. One hears a concept, the other feels a rearrangement. The difference is not intelligence. It is readiness. When readiness is present, language does more than inform. It unlocks. It exposes what was already near the surface but not yet named clearly enough to be stabilized. That is why you may feel as though parts of this are less like learning and more like remembering. Not because you have heard the exact wording before, but because the structure underneath it meets something already forming inside you. This is where many people make the mistake of retreating into analysis too soon. They feel the shift, then immediately try to reduce it. They ask whether it is rational, whether it is provable, whether they can justify why it feels significant. But the problem with rushing back to analysis is that analysis often serves the very structure that is being interrupted. It tries to restore the previous order too quickly. It asks the old self to evaluate the moment that may be undoing the old self. That is why stillness is important here, not passivity, not blind surrender. Just enough stillness to notice that something beyond ordinary interpretation may be taking place. Because if you are honest, something has changed in the quality of your attention. At the beginning, you may have been listening from the surface, comparing, testing, measuring. That is normal. But somewhere along the way, another layer may have become active. The part of you that does not need every truth to arrive in polished logic before it can recognize its weight. The part of you that knows some things by the effect they have on your nervous system, your breathing, your posture, your silence. That shift is not imaginary. It is what happens when an old internal arrangement begins losing its monopoly over what you were allowed to register as real. And that is why this moment can feel both subtle and irreversible at the same time. Subtle, because nothing theatrical needs to happen. Irreversible, because once a deeper layer recognizes the pattern, it becomes very difficult to return fully to the old way of dismissing yourself. This is what activation often looks like in real life. Not fireworks, not spectacle, not some dramatic external sign that convinces everyone around you. It often looks like this. A sentence lands differently. A part of the body responds before the mind catches up. The usual internal noise weakens for a moment. Something in you becomes less interested in arguing and more interested in listening. A recognition begins that cannot be fully translated without losing part of its force. That is not fantasy. That is what it feels like when the old system is no longer the only thing governing your perception. The old system wants speed, labels, and control. It wants every signal converted into something manageable. It wants to preserve identity by preserving interpretation. But when that system starts losing control, your experience changes. You stop needing everything to come through the same narrow channel. You begin receiving through more than thought alone. And that is why the body becomes important. The body is not merely reacting. It is revealing where the old pattern is loosening and where a deeper coherence is beginning to form. The chest tightens where truth meets resistance. The mind quiets where distortion loses volume. The breath changes where a hidden fear is being exposed. The skin responds where attention becomes more charged. These are not decorations on the experience. They are part of the experience. So do not treat this as passive listening. Treat it as contact. Not contact with something outside you in the simplistic sense. Contact with a layer of knowing that has been present but obstructed. Contact with the part of you that does not need endless proof to recognize when the old arrangement is being interrupted. Contact with the exact threshold where emotion, perception, and truth begin to align strongly enough that the next sentence can land where it needs to. That is why this cannot be reduced to content. Content informs. This does more than inform. It exposes. It activates. It removes cover from what your life has already been trying to show you. And once that begins, the words are no longer the main event. They are only the bridge that carried you to the point where something deeper in you started to answer. You were never standing outside of what you were trying to reach. That is the cup. That is the truth. The old mind resists because it rearranges the whole structure at once. As long as you believe you are a separate self trying to find the signal, the search never ends. You keep reaching, asking, waiting, hoping for some sign that will finally connect you to what you think has been elsewhere all along. You imagine truth as something distant, hidden, external, conditional. You imagine alignment as a future state. You imagine peace as a reward. You imagine the field as something vast that you must somehow access, convince, or deserve. That entire arrangement is built on one mistake. The mistake is not that you have been seeking. The mistake is what you believed yourself to be while seeking. You were taught to think of yourself as a closed individual moving through a separate world, a mind inside a body, trying to make contact with forces beyond it, a personal consciousness hoping to align with a larger intelligence. That model has shaped almost everything. It shaped your fear. It shaped your loneliness. It shaped your need to control. It shaped your belief that guidance must come from outside, that purpose must be discovered, that life is something happening to you while you try to respond well enough to survive it. But that model begins to collapse the moment you see the deeper truth clearly enough. You are not a separate being trying to establish connection with the field. You are the point through which the field is becoming conscious of itself in this form. That is why the search has felt so exhausting. Not because truth was hiding from you, but because the one doing the searching was built on a false division. You were looking for the ocean while standing in water. You were waiting for the signal while speaking from inside it. You were asking how to enter what has never been outside you for a single moment. This is not a poetic exaggeration. It is the correction of the core error. There is no true separation between your consciousness and the living field that gives rise to experience. The separation has felt real because it has been organized into your habits, your language, your nervous system, and your social world. It has been repeated so often that it hardened into identity. But repetition is not proof. Conditioning is not truth. Familiarity is not accuracy. What you call self has been a narrowed lens, not an isolated source. What you call your life has been a localized expression, not a disconnected event. What you call your awareness has never been sealed off from the deeper intelligence moving through everything. That is why certain moments feel less like learning and more like remembering, because this truth does not arrive as foreign material. It arrives as recognition. It lands beneath argument. It bypasses performance. It carries the quiet force of something ancient in you finally becoming undeniable. You do not hear it as information alone. You feel it as the end of a strain you may not have known you were carrying. The strain of pretending to be separate, the strain of trying to force outcomes from a frightened identity, the strain of believing you had to earn contact with what was already breathing through you. That strain begins to loosen the moment you understand this correctly. Not as a slogan, not as a comforting spiritual idea, as a structural fact. You are not trying to connect to the field. You have never been outside it. The awareness reading these words is not apart from the deeper intelligence you have been naming from a distance. It is one expression of it, not a piece cut off from the whole, not a visitor, not an exile. A living aperture through which the whole is looking, sensing, choosing, and becoming specific. That changes everything, because once that becomes real, even for a second, the old logic loses credibility. You stop treating intuition as a mysterious outside message and begin recognizing it as a deeper layer of your own being moving ahead of surface thought. You stop treating synchronicity as random magic and begin seeing it as pattern coherence between inner recognition and outer arrangement. You stop treating purpose as a hidden object and begin seeing it as the form your truth takes when resistance weakens. You stop treating guidance as something you must chase and begin understanding that the guidance is arising from within the very field you thought you were separate from. This is why the deepest shift is not behavioral at first. It is ontological. It changes what you understand yourself to be. And once that changes, behavior follows with much less effort. Because the exhausted self that kept trying to manage reality through fear is no longer the only authority in the room. A quieter authority begins to emerge, a deeper coherence, a steadier kind of knowing, not loud, not dramatic, not interested in performance, just unmistakable. It does not need to prove itself in the usual way because it is not borrowing certainty from external approval. It carries the calm of alignment with what has always been true underneath the noise. This is also why loneliness begins to change when this recognition lands. Not because you suddenly become surrounded by perfect people, not because every wound disappears, but because the most fundamental isolation starts losing its grip. The feeling of being a disconnected self in a cold world begins to crack. You start to realize that what you are is not a sealed fragment asking the universe for signs. What you are is the universe, here, in this precise perspective, becoming aware of itself through your questions, your choices, your grief, your intelligence, your body, your timing. That does not make your individuality unreal. It makes it sacred in a different way. Your individuality is not a prison of separation. It is a temporary angle of perception, a unique opening, a singular expression through which the deeper field experiences this exact life. That means your life is not evidence of distance from source. It is one of the ways source becomes specific. This is why what is waking up in you feels both personal and larger than personal at the same time. Personal, because it is happening through your memories, your nervous system, your choices, your history. Larger than personal, because what is waking up is not limited to the small self that has been narrating your life from fear and control. Something older is surfacing, something more original, something that does not need to become true because it already is. And when that recognition begins to settle, a different sentence becomes possible. Not, how do I find the signal? Not, how do I align with the field? Not, how do I earn the right path? The sentence becomes simpler and far more demanding. I am not searching for the signal. I am the signal becoming conscious of itself. Sit with that without rushing away. Because if that is true, then much of your suffering came from trying to solve your life from the wrong center. If that is true, then what felt like disconnection was often the pain of misidentification. If that is true, then the answer was never elsewhere. It was buried under a way of seeing that trained you to look out while ignoring what had already begun within. You were never outside the field. You were never cut off from the intelligence you kept trying to reach. What is waking in you now is not contact with something foreign. It is the field, through your own awareness, remembering its face. And that is why this does not feel like a new belief. It feels like a truth you have been standing inside your entire life, finally becoming clear enough that you can no longer mistake yourself for anything smaller. If the recognition is real, it will leave evidence. Not the kind of evidence that satisfies every skeptic at once. Not the kind that turns your life into a performance. The evidence is quieter than that, but also harder to dismiss once you begin noticing the pattern. Real activation does not stay trapped in theory. It moves through emotion, through the body, through daily life. It alters how you feel, how you respond, what you can tolerate, what your system rejects, and what reality begins reflecting back. That is why the signs matter. Not because you need to force yourself to believe, but because once you see how many of these are already happening, you stop treating this as an interesting idea and start recognizing it as a present process. The shift becomes measurable in the places where you actually live, in your feelings, in your nervous system, in your choices, in the rhythm of ordinary life. The first signs usually appear in the emotional field. You may feel sudden relief, almost out of proportion to what has actually changed on the outside. Not excitement, not euphoria, relief. As if something in you has been carrying tension for far too long, and for one moment that tension loosens without needing a full explanation. You may even feel close to tears for no obvious reason. Not because you are falling apart, but because a deeper part of you recognizes that it no longer has to keep holding itself together in the old way. That response is important because when truth reaches below the mind, the first reaction is often release. Not drama, release. A pressure leaves, a defense softens. A burden you had normalized becomes visible the moment it starts lifting. Another emotional sign is this. The compulsion to search outside yourself starts weakening. Not because you suddenly know every answer, but because the desperate hunt loses intensity. The constant need to collect more opinions, more signs, more validation, more frameworks, more reassurance begins to look less necessary. You may still care about guidance, but it no longer feels like survival. There is less hunger in it, less panic, less grasping. That change is not laziness. It is what happens when the seeker starts realizing that the center of gravity has moved inward. You may also notice a very unusual calm beginning to appear in the middle of uncertainty, not because your circumstances are solved, not because your future is mapped, but because some deeper layer in you has stopped demanding immediate answers in order to feel safe. This kind of calm does not come from control, it comes from coherence. You are still aware that things are shifting, but the fear does not run the entire system the way it used to. That is one of the strongest signs. When uncertainty remains, but panic loses authority, then the body begins to speak more clearly. You may feel heaviness in the chest, followed by a strange sense of opening. Not every time, not dramatically, but enough to notice that your body is processing more than your thoughts are saying. It can feel like pressure, then space, constriction, then breath. As if something in you tightens when truth gets close, then releases when the resistance weakens. This is not unusual. The body often carries the lag between what you know and what you are still afraid to live. You may also notice that your head gets quieter. Not empty, not numb, just quieter. The usual spinning, rehearsing, defending, and over-explaining may reduce for brief periods. You may have moments where your thoughts are present, but less aggressive, less crowded, less convinced they need to control every outcome. If you have lived with constant internal noise, this shift can feel unfamiliar enough that you might mistrust it at first. But often it is a sign that interference is dropping. The old mental system is not disappearing overnight. It is simply losing exclusive control of the channel. Your body may also start telling the truth about environments long before your mind does. Places that once felt normal may begin to feel too loud, too dense, too artificial, too draining. Certain rooms, conversations, routines, even social settings can start feeling like clothing that no longer fits. Nothing may look different from the outside, yet your nervous system reacts as if it has outgrown the frequency. You may feel tired faster, irritated sooner, more closed in certain spaces, more expanded in others. This is not weakness, it is calibration. The body is no longer willing to keep pretending that every environment costs the same. Another sign is a distortion in your experience of time. Some moments feel stretched, others collapse. Days can feel unusually dense, as if too much is happening internally for the clock to measure it properly. At times, you may feel as though you have been inside one realization for far longer than the actual hour suggests. At other times, whole weeks seem to disappear because your inner process is moving on a different scale than your outer schedule. This does not mean you are losing control. It often means your awareness is becoming less obedient to purely mechanical time. Then life around you starts joining the pattern. Synchronicities usually intensify first. Certain numbers, names, phrases, themes, or symbols begin showing up more often and with more relevance. Not in a vague, decorative way, in a way that feels precise enough to interrupt dismissal. You ask a question, and some form of answer appears through a conversation, a page, a chance encounter, a repeated image, a line you were not looking for. Again, the point is not any single event. The point is the increase in coherence. Reality begins to mirror more directly. You may also start seeing with uncomfortable clarity what has to end. A relationship you kept rationalizing suddenly becomes impossible to misread. A job you kept calling practical begins to feel unbearable. A version of yourself you kept defending starts looking obviously expired. This is not because you became more negative. It is because once coherence increases, misalignment becomes harder to anesthetize. What was once tolerable becomes sharp. What was once manageable becomes costly. What was once explainable becomes dishonest. This is one of the clearest real-world signs of activation. Misaligned decisions stop feeling neutral. They begin to hurt. Not metaphorically, systemically. Your energy drops around them. Your body tightens around them. Your mind can still produce reasons, but the reasons lose persuasive force. You begin to understand in real time that certain paths are not merely imperfect. They are incompatible. And other people may notice the shift before you fully understand it yourself. Someone may tell you that you seem different, more serious, more grounded, quieter, harder to read, less available for nonsense, more present. Others may not have the language, but they sense a change in your field. Some will be drawn to it. Some will be unsettled by it. Some will feel that they no longer know how to place you. That is not always comfortable, but it matters. When your internal organization changes, your external presence changes with it. There are other signs too. You may feel less able to fake enthusiasm, less interested in explaining yourself, less attracted to noise, more sensitive to what is false, more loyal to what you cannot yet fully prove, but already know. None of these signs stand alone. That is the point. Taken one by one, each could be dismissed. But taken together, they form a pattern that is difficult to mistake. Emotional release, reduced external seeking, calm inside uncertainty, chest pressure and opening, a quieter mind, increased sensitivity to place and people, distorted time, more synchronicity, clearer endings, misalignment becoming intolerable, others sensing your shift. That is not random fluctuation. That is integration. It means the recognition is not staying in the abstract. It is moving into your system. It is reorganizing your perception. It is beginning to change what your life will and will not support. So if many of these signs are already happening, stop asking whether something is wrong. Ask whether something true has finally become too strong to keep living underneath what no longer matches it. Because that is what activation often looks like. Not becoming someone else. Becoming unable to continue betraying what you already are. Recognition means nothing if it does not change the way you live. That is where most people break the chain. They feel the truth. They resonate with it. They even know it is real while they are hearing it. But then they return to the old pattern of waiting. Waiting for more certainty. Waiting for better timing. Waiting for perfect language. Waiting for enough proof to protect them from the cost of change. And that is how a real opening becomes another memory instead of a new life. Truth does not become transformative when you admire it. It becomes transformative when you stop negotiating against it. That is the line. If something in you has already recognized what is happening, then the question is no longer whether the signal is real. The question is whether you will continue betraying what you already know, because that betrayal is what created so much suffering in the first place. Not lack of intelligence, not lack of worth, not lack of signs. The suffering deepened every time you knew and still delayed. Every time your system told you no and your fear translated it into maybe. Every time your life made an ending obvious and your habits called it confusion. Every time clarity appeared and you asked for one more round of permission. That is over if this is real. A different life does not begin when the world changes first. It begins when your loyalty changes. It begins when you stop giving your deepest allegiance to fear, convenience, appearance, and old logic, and start giving it to what has already become clear beneath them. That shift can be named simply 3 commitments, not dramatic promises, not performance, not spiritual theater, just 3 decisions strong enough to reorganize a life if they are lived honestly. The first is this: I will stop betraying what I have known for a long time. That sounds simple until you realize how much of ordinary life is built on doing exactly the opposite. You knew certain things long before you admitted them. You knew when a relationship had turned into maintenance instead of truth. You knew when an environment was draining more than it was building. You knew when your body tightened around a path your mind kept defending. You knew when you were calling survival by the name of purpose. You knew when your silence was not peace, but self-abandonment. The problem was rarely a lack of knowing. The problem was a lack of loyalty to what you knew. This is why the first commitment matters more than almost anything else. It restores internal trust. It ends the split between perception and action. The moment you stop betraying what has already become clear, your energy starts returning. Decision-making becomes cleaner. Anxiety loses one of its main food sources. Confusion begins to thin. Not because the world suddenly simplifies, but because you are no longer fighting yourself from the inside. A person becomes powerful the moment they stop arguing against their own deeper signal. The second commitment is this: I will release what does not belong to the frequency I am entering. This is where many people hesitate, because release sounds like loss until you see what holding on has cost you. You cannot carry expired structures into a more coherent life and expect coherence to remain intact. You cannot ask for a different reality while feeding the pattern that keeps recreating the old one. You cannot enter a clearer frequency while preserving every attachment that was built to keep you small, hidden, divided, or numb. Some things are not evil. They are simply complete. Some roles are not wrong. They are simply over. Some relationships are not dramatic failures. They are containers you no longer fit inside without shrinking. This is why release is sacred when it is honest. It is not rejection. It is not punishment. It is alignment made visible. It is the moment you stop mistaking familiarity for truth. The moment you understand that what once carried you can become the very thing that now holds you below the next level of your own life. If you hold on to what is complete, it does not become more alive. It becomes heavier, and eventually your whole system has to work harder just to protect what should have been released. That is why this commitment changes everything. The moment you begin letting go of what no longer belongs to your next frequency, space returns, breath returns, energy returns. Synchronicity becomes clearer because the noise loses volume. The path becomes easier to read because you are no longer standing in rooms your soul already left. The third commitment is this: I will take the first step before all the evidence appears. This is where the old self protests the loudest. It wants guarantees. It wants a map. It wants certainty without movement. But life does not reveal itself that way at the deeper level. The next layer of guidance often appears after motion, not before it. The signal sharpens through response. Clarity strengthens through participation. Reality begins answering more directly when it sees that you are no longer waiting to be carried past the point where courage is required. This does not mean reckless action. It means honest action. One step that proves you are no longer asking your fear to approve your future. One conversation, one boundary, one ending, one application, one decision, one act of withdrawal from what drains you, one act of devotion to what feels more true than convenient. That is enough to begin changing the architecture, because action does something thought cannot do. It tells reality that your recognition is no longer theoretical. It turns inner truth into external instruction. It creates coherence between what you know and what you do. And when that coherence begins, life responds faster. That is not fantasy. It is one of the most practical consequences of alignment. Decisions become less tangled because you stop consulting 10 voices after your own signal has already spoken. Loneliness decreases because the deepest loneliness was never the absence of people. It was the experience of being abandoned by yourself. Synchronicity becomes clearer because you are no longer flooding the channel with contradiction. Your inner gravity increases because people feel when someone is no longer negotiating their own truth for comfort. And reality starts answering faster because you are no longer sending mixed instructions through divided living. That is what transformation actually looks like. Not becoming louder, becoming cleaner, not becoming more impressive, becoming more coherent, not collecting more beliefs, removing the gap between what you know and how you move. This is why these commitments matter. They are not motivational lines. They are thresholds. If you live them, you change. If you avoid them, you return to abstraction. Read them again in the deepest sense. I will stop betraying what I have known for a long time. I will release what does not belong to the frequency I am entering. I will take the first step before all the evidence appears. There is more force in those sentences than in years of passive insight. Because a life changes the moment truth is no longer admired from a distance, but obeyed from within. And once that starts, the results become visible. You feel less split. You hesitate less. You explain yourself less. You recover energy that had been trapped inside contradiction. You start noticing that certain doors open with less friction, that some people fall away without a fight, that some answers arrive the moment you stop begging for them, that some forms of peace were never waiting for the world to become safe. They were waiting for you to stop living against what you already knew. This is the shift. From recognition to loyalty, from loyalty to movement, from movement to evidence, and from evidence to a life that no longer feels like it is happening around you, but through you. This window will not stay open in the same way for long. That is not meant to frighten you. It is meant to make you honest. There are moments in a life when recognition becomes unusually clear, not because truth suddenly begins to exist, but because you become available to it in a way you were not before. The conditions line up. The noise drops just enough. The old explanations weaken just enough. The deeper signal gets through. And for a brief period, you can see with a precision that is rare. That is the period you are in now. Most people make the same mistake here. They feel the recognition, then treat it like a mood. They assume they can return to it later with the same openness, the same sharpness, the same internal honesty. Usually they cannot. Not because the truth disappears, but because the mind quickly begins rebuilding the old arrangement. Habit returns, noise returns, delay returns. The self that was just exposed begins trying to regain control by calling the moment intense, interesting, emotional, or premature. It will use any label that lets it avoid obedience. That is why you cannot leave this the same way you entered it. If you walk away as the old version of yourself, the door will close the way it always closes. Quietly. No punishment, no drama, just contraction. The signal fades back beneath routine. The clarity becomes harder to feel. The urgency gets translated into overthinking. What was direct becomes conceptual again, and then one day you look back and realize you did not lose the truth. You lost the courage to move while it was alive in you. That is the real risk. Not that you will be denied another message. Not that life will abandon you, but that you will turn a living recognition into a memory by refusing to anchor it when it had force. This is why timing matters more than comfort. A real threshold is not crossed by agreement alone. It is crossed by response. The opening becomes stable only when you do something that tells your system and your life that this was not just heard. It was accepted. It was taken seriously. It was given a place in behavior. Until that happens, part of you still believes this can remain abstract. And what remains abstract has no authority against old habit. So do not confuse feeling moved with being changed. Do not confuse resonance with commitment. Do not confuse recognition with embodiment. The distance between knowing and living is where most people lose themselves again. That distance must close now. Not perfectly, not dramatically, but immediately. Something has to be anchored before you step back into the noise. Something simple but real, a line you will not cross backward, a signal to your own nervous system that says the old negotiation is over. This is how thresholds become lived reality, not through spectacle, through clean, honest acts that remove ambiguity. Because once you anchor the recognition, the relationship between you and your life changes. You stop moving through reality like someone waiting for permission. You begin moving like someone who has finally stopped asking the wrong self to approve the next chapter. That shift does not only affect you, it changes every space you enter. This is the part that matters more than people realize. Your awakening is not private in its effects. Your clarity alters the field around you. When a person stops living in contradiction, other people feel it, even if they cannot name it. When someone becomes more coherent, more honest, more aligned with what they know, the rooms they enter are no longer neutral. The conversations change. The emotional temperature changes. The standard changes. Some people feel safer. Some feel challenged. Some pull closer. Some fall away. But no one meets a truly coherent presence without being affected by it. That is why this is not just about personal relief. Yes, your decisions become cleaner. Yes, your loneliness begins to loosen. Yes, your path becomes easier to read, but the effect moves beyond your own life. Every person who stops feeding distortion weakens distortion in the spaces they touch. Every person who chooses truth over performance makes that choice more available to others. Every person who stops betraying their own signal becomes a point of order in a culture built on noise. You do not need to preach to do that. You do not need to explain yourself constantly. You do not need to convince anyone. Living it is enough. Coherence transmits on its own. That is the mission hidden inside this moment. Not to become grand, not to become spiritually impressive, not to build a new identity around having received some special message. The mission is simpler and much harder. To become someone who no longer abandons what is true once it becomes visible. To become someone whose life begins organizing around deeper honesty. To become someone whose presence carries less confusion because the war inside them has quieted. That kind of change reaches further than you can measure. So this moment requires one thing from you: a mark, a seal, a deliberate act that tells the part of you now waking up that it has been recognized and that it will not be sent back underground without a response. Do not leave this moment undefined. Do not walk away without naming what has just become real. Leave one word that belongs to the version of you that knows this is not random. One word that closes the distance between recognition and embodiment. One word that your future self can return to when the old noise tries to reclaim the room. If the signal reached you, lock it in with one word. Remember, or choose your own word, if another one rises with more force. Truth, enough, release, forward, alive, but make it one word, not a paragraph, not an explanation, a marker, a threshold word, a word that says, this is where the old pattern lost its authority. Write it before you leave, not for performance, not for approval, for anchoring, because the moment you name a threshold consciously, you stop treating it like an accident. And if this landed the way it was meant to, then you already know this is not the end of something small. It is the beginning of a different relationship with your own life, a cleaner one, a stricter one, a more alive one. The kind that asks more from you because it no longer permits you to hide inside what you already know is over. So do not leave as the person who almost listened. Do not leave as the person who felt it and still chose delay. Do not leave as the person who recognized the signal and then dissolved back into habit before it could become a decision. Leave marked, leave named, leave aligned with something that can still be felt right now while the opening is clear. This window is not permanent, but this choice can be one word that is enough. If, seal it